My wealthy boss humiliated a waiter for a small mistake, laughing, "People like you should be grateful we even acknowledge you." Disgusted, I secretly paid the bill and left a huge tip. Months later, that same waiter walked into our office, but this time, he was the new CEO. My boss turned pale as he realized who he had insulted. I work at a big financial firm in New York City. My boss, Mr. Richard Grant, is known for his wealth and sharp mind. He's in his late 50s, tall, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He always wears tailored suits and carries himself with authority. People respect him for his business skills, but also fear his short temper and high expectations. One evening, after a long day at the office, Mr. Grant invited our team to dinner at Le Bernardin, a fancy restaurant in Manhattan. The place was elegant, with soft lighting and a quiet atmosphere. It was the kind of place where every detail mattered, and the staff worked hard to keep everything perfect. Our waiter that night was a young man named Daniel. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with short brown hair and a slim build. He wore the standard uniform, a crisp white shirt, black vest, and tie. Daniel seemed a bit nervous, but was polite and attentive as he took our orders and served our drinks. Everything was going smoothly until Daniel came to refill Mr. Grant's glass of red wine. As he poured, his hand shook slightly, and a few drops spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth. The deep red stain was small, but it stood out against the white fabric. Mr. Grant noticed immediately. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his face. "Well," he said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby diners, "it seems competence is hard to find these days." He chuckled, looking around as if expecting others to join in his amusement. Daniel's face turned pale. He quickly grabbed a cloth from his apron and dabbed at the spill, stammering, "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. Let me clean this up right away." But Mr. Grant wasn't done. He waved Daniel's efforts away and said, "People like you should be grateful we even acknowledge you." His tone was dismissive, and his words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. The table fell silent. My colleagues avoided eye contact, staring at their plates or glancing around uncomfortably. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The humiliation on Daniel's face was clear. He nodded quickly, whispered another apology, and retreated to the kitchen. The rest of the meal continued in awkward silence. Mr. Grant seemed unfazed, enjoying his meal as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's embarrassed face from my mind. When the check arrived, I noticed that Mr. Grant didn't leave a tip. Before leaving, I discreetly placed a generous tip on the table, hoping it would make up, even a little, for the way Daniel had been treated. Months passed, and our firm was buzzing with news of a potential merger. Rumors swirled about a larger corporation looking to acquire us. Speculation was rampant about what this would mean for our jobs and who would be in charge. Then came the day of the big announcement. An all-hands meeting was called in the main conference room. Employees filled the space, murmuring among themselves, eager to hear the news. Mr. Grant stood at the front, looking confident as always. He cleared his throat, and the room quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I am pleased to introduce you to our new CEO, Mr. Daniel Whitmore." Applause filled the room as a man stepped forward. My breath caught in my throat. It was Daniel, the waiter from that night at Le Bernardin. But he looked different. Gone was the nervous young man in a waiter's uniform. Now, he stood tall and confident, wearing a sharp navy blue suit. His brown hair was neatly styled, and he carried an air of authority. Daniel smiled warmly at the crowd. "Thank you, Mr. Grant," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's a pleasure to be here and to lead this esteemed firm into its next chapter." I glanced at Mr. Grant. His face had gone pale, and he seemed to sway slightly. He quickly masked his shock, forcing a tight-lipped smile, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Daniel continued, "I started my career in finance, but during my studies, I worked various jobs to support myself, including waiting tables. Those experiences taught me the value of hard work and respect for all professions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I believe that every role, no matter how small it may seem, contributes to the success of an organization. And as we move forward, I want to foster a culture of mutual respect and appreciation for everyone's contributions." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I stole another glance at Mr. Grant. He stood rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. After the meeting, as people mingled and introduced themselves to Daniel, I noticed Mr. Grant slipping out of the room quietly. His usual commanding presence was diminished, and for the first time, he seemed vulnerable. Over the next few weeks, changes swept through the company. Daniel implemented new policies emphasizing employee well-being and open communication. The work environment improved, and morale was higher than it had been in years. As for Mr. Grant, he kept a low profile. The once dominant figure now seemed subdued, attending meetings without his usual bravado. Eventually, he announced his early retirement, citing personal reasons. The experience served as a powerful reminder: treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position. You never know where life will take them or you. A few weeks after Daniel became CEO, things started shifting fast. At first, everyone at the firm was walking on eggshells. Not because of Daniel, but because of how they had acted under Mr. Grant. Many had laughed at his jokes, followed his orders blindly, or stayed quiet during his outbursts. They weren't sure what Daniel remembered or if he'd hold it against them. To everyone's surprise, he didn't bring up the past. He was calm, professional, and polite with everyone. But something about how quiet he was made people nervous, especially Mr. Grant. I started noticing things. Mr. Grant, who had once strutted through the office like he owned it, now stayed behind closed doors. He took longer lunches, left early, and skipped staff meetings, something he never used to do. He also started avoiding Daniel completely. If he knew Daniel would be in the office, he'd find an excuse to work from home. One day, I was walking past the glass conference room and saw Daniel sitting with the board of directors. It wasn't a casual meeting. I could see their serious faces, nodding, some taking notes, others watching him speak with intensity. Something was going on. Later that week, I ran into Daniel near the elevators. He remembered me. "You were at that dinner, right?" he asked. My heart dropped. I nodded. "Yeah, I was." He gave me a tight smile. "Thanks for what you did." I didn't know what to say. I hadn't done much, just paid a tip. But maybe that night had meant more to him than I realized. Then came the memo. It was sent to senior management first. I saw it because I was copied on a follow-up. Mr. Grant was being repositioned to a new advisory role. It was a nice way of saying he was being pushed out, stripped of real power. His role would now report directly to Daniel. No more board access. No decision-making authority. When the announcement went public the next day, the office was silent. Mr. Grant didn't show up. The next twist came the following Monday. A compliance audit was announced and HR began asking questions about hiring practices, financials, even workplace behavior. Whispers started circulating that some of Mr. Grant's deals were being looked into. Stuff that had been brushed under the rug for years was being pulled back into the light. That's when things got weird. I started getting messages from blocked numbers. Just vague things. Watch your back. Don't trust him. At first, I ignored them. But then someone left a note on my desk. No envelope. No signature. Just one sentence written in messy handwriting: "He's not who you think he is." I didn't know who. He was supposed to be Daniel? Mr. Grant? Someone else? Later that week, I stayed late at the office, finishing a report. The cleaning crew had already gone, and the place was quiet. Too quiet. I heard someone down the hall. A door creaked open. I called out. No one answered. When I checked, there was no one there, but one of the file room drawers had been left wide open. I didn't say anything to Daniel. Not yet. Then, two of my coworkers were suddenly let go. No warning. They were both senior, had been with the firm for over a decade. Rumor was they were connected to an internal investigation. That's when I realized this wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about what Mr. Grant did to Daniel that night in the restaurant. Something bigger was happening. Something Daniel wasn't telling us. And the deeper I looked, the more cracks I started to see. A few days after those senior employees were let go, the tension in the office was impossible to ignore. People were whispering in the hallways. Some desks were suddenly empty. The energy shifted, nervous, cautious. No one knew who would be next. Daniel stayed calm. Every morning, he arrived early, made rounds through departments, checked in with people, smiled politely. On the surface, he looked like the picture of a composed leader. But I started noticing inconsistencies. Files missing from the shared drive. Certain emails getting auto-deleted. A few of us in mid-management were starting to see things not lining up. Budget reports didn't match up with actual expenses. Travel costs from the past 6 months looked inflated, but no one had been traveling. Some old projects had vanished off our archives. One night, after another long shift, I decided to check an old internal server, one that hadn't been used since before the merger. Buried deep in it, I found a folder labeled Alt Trust Holdings. That was a dummy account we used back in the day for discrete investments, stuff that Grant didn't want on the books, but technically wasn't illegal. It had been dormant for years. But the folder had recent updates, timestamps from just a few weeks ago. Inside were transfers. Large ones. Millions. And they were signed off by Daniel. I sat there staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. Daniel had just become CEO. Why would he touch that account? Unless he already knew about it before he even walked in. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked into the office like nothing was wrong, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Was Daniel digging into the company because of what happened to him, or because he had his own plans all along? That same day, Mr. Grant showed up unannounced. He looked rough. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The usual arrogance was gone, replaced with something else: desperation. He went straight to Daniel's office and slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed across the floor. No one knew what was being said, but people stood frozen at their desks, trying to listen. 20 minutes later, Grant stormed out. His face was red, fists clenched. He didn't say a word, just walked straight out of the building. Daniel emerged a few minutes later, calm as ever. But for a split second, I caught something in his eyes, something cold. Then the subpoenas started coming in. One went to legal, one to accounting, one to IT. Internal investigations weren't just internal anymore. Federal agents were showing up in suits, asking quiet questions. A week later, HR called me in. They wanted to know about a specific wire transfer I had nothing to do with. I told them the truth, showed them my activity logs, cleared it up fast. But something about the way they looked at each other during the interview told me they weren't just checking me, they were watching to see how much I knew. That night, I got another message. But this one was an email from a private, encrypted account. No name, no greeting, just a link. It opened to a scanned document. It was a scanned photo of a contract, an agreement between Alt Trust Holdings and another shell company I'd never heard of, signed over a year ago. But the second signature on that document was Daniel Whitmore. Over a year ago. Before he ever stepped foot into our building. Before the restaurant. Before Mr. Grant humiliated him. Which meant Daniel didn't just rise up from hardship. He had planned this. All of it. The dinner that night? He knew who Grant was. The merger? He was already working the system. The CEO's seat? He didn't earn it through luck or hard work. He took it, piece by piece, while everyone thought they were watching a revenge story. But it wasn't revenge. It was a takeover. A calculated one. And now I was tangled in the middle of it. The morning everything broke wide open, the sky over Manhattan was gray and heavy, like it knew what was coming. By that point, the tension in the office had reached a quiet, unbearable pressure. People walked fast, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided eye contact. No one dared ask questions anymore. The silence felt like the kind that came before a storm. The board called for a town hall meeting. Every department was required to attend. No remote work excuses, no absences. We gathered in the auditorium, over 200 of us. No one knew why. Just that Daniel would be speaking. He walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit, no tie, sleeves rolled halfway up like he was ready to get into something deep. He didn't smile. He walked straight to the podium, pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase, and looked out over the crowd. "I won't waste your time," he said. Then he started reading. Page after page. Transactions. Transfers. Internal memos. Confidential emails. Signatures, most of them Grant's, but some from current VPs. And all tied to a massive financial cover-up dating back nearly a decade. The air was sucked out of the room. People were stunned. Faces went white. Some gasped. And then Daniel dropped the final page, the real blow. It was a whistleblower disclosure. Filed 6 months ago. With his name on it. He had reported everything to the feds long before he became CEO. This wasn't personal revenge anymore. It was a takedown of a corrupt system. "I waited tables to put myself through school," Daniel said. "I've worked as a janitor. A delivery guy. I've eaten leftovers from customer plates. And I've been laughed at by people who assumed they were untouchable." He turned slightly. His eyes locked on Mr. Grant, who had been sitting near the front, stone-faced. "But none of that made me hate success. What I hate is the rot underneath it." And that was it. The room exploded. Some people stood up, shouting. A few executives bolted from their seats and ran out. Phones were buzzing everywhere. People calling lawyers, HR, spouses. Mr. Grant didn't move. He just sat there, breathing heavily, jaw clenched. But I saw his hand tremble on his lap. Then he stood, slowly, and walked to the front of the room. "I built this firm from nothing," he said, voice sharp. "I hired most of the people in this room. I didn't steal. I managed risk. That's what you all wanted, results. You just didn't want to know how I got them." Daniel didn't flinch. "You humiliated people who couldn't fight back. I just happened to be one of them. But I wasn't unarmed." Grant turned to the crowd. "You all followed me. You laughed at my jokes. You never questioned my methods. So don't pretend you're innocent now." The silence that followed was thicker than anything I've ever felt. People looked away. Some wiped their eyes. Others clenched their fists. And then he said it, under his breath, but loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "You were a waiter. You'll always be a waiter." The security team was already moving. They gently took Mr. Grant by the arm and walked him out. He didn't resist. The fallout came fast. That week, multiple executives resigned. Others were placed on leave. Investigations ramped up. Journalists camped outside our building. Everyone was on edge. But it wasn't just about job security anymore. It was about betrayal. About realizing that some of us had looked the other way for too long. At lunch, a few of us sat quietly together. One woman, Janice, who'd worked there since the beginning, finally broke the silence. "We all saw it," she whispered. "We just didn't want to deal with it. I thought staying quiet kept me safe. Turns out it made me complicit." I didn't have anything to say. A week later, Daniel called me into his office. "I know you've been looking into things," he said. "The alt trust account. The old servers." I felt my throat tighten. "You were smart," he continued. "Careful. That's rare." I didn't know if I was being praised or warned. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a promotion offer. A raise. New responsibilities. A seat closer to power. I stared at it for a long moment. "Why me?" I asked. "You saw what was coming. And you didn't flinch." I took the offer, but I didn't feel victorious. Even now, weeks later, I still don't know if I did the right thing. Sometimes I think about Daniel, standing at that podium, holding up the whole house of cards for everyone to see. And I wonder, was it justice? Or just a better disguise? I've stopped waiting for clear answers. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never forget the look on Mr. Grant's face when he realized the waiter he humiliated was the man who took everything from him. Sometimes life doesn't give you clean revenge or perfect redemption. Sometimes it just gives you the truth and lets you decide what to do with it.